Welcome to Translano. Hey, there. I'm so glad you're here. This is a space where we celebrate self-expression, individuality, and empowerment. I grew up in a house where roles were treated like furniture. They were there, they had a place, and you didn't move them around unless you wanted a mess. My father was steady in the way that looked like silence. My mother carried the household like a second spine. Nobody said, "This is what men do, this is what women do," at least not directly, but it was written into the rhythm of our days. Men left the house for work, came back tired, sat down. Women kept the house running, noticed what was missing, paid attention to feelings even when nobody asked them to. I loved both of my parents. I also watched them the way kids watch adults, trying to decode what it took to be safe and accepted. When I was little, I didn't have language for identity. I had sensations and rules. The rules were clear: don't cry too much, don't act soft, don't embarrass your family. The sensations were less clear. I remember being drawn to the textures my mother wore, the softness of sweaters, the way certain fabrics moved when she walked. I remember how the world allowed her to be gentle with people, how she could ask questions without being mocked for not knowing something, how she could show concern without it being interpreted as weakness. I didn't envy her exactly. I was fascinated by the permission she seemed to have to be emotionally attentive. The first time I put on something that wasn't meant for me, it wasn't sexual, and it wasn't a joke. It was an accident of timing and curiosity. I was maybe 7. I had stayed home sick. My mother was in the kitchen, my father at work, and I wandered into her bedroom because I liked the smell of her perfume and the quiet of a room that didn't expect anything from me. I opened a drawer and saw stockings, folded carefully. I remember the strange intimacy of that drawer, the sense that I'd found a private language. I slid one stocking up my leg and stared at my skin looking different, not transformed into someone else, but reframed, like a picture moved into a new light. I stood there for a few seconds, heart beating fast, not because I felt thrilled but because I felt caught even before anyone walked in. Nothing happened that day. No one discovered me. I put it back, closed the drawer, went back to the couch and watched cartoons like I hadn't just touched something that made my brain hum. But the feeling stayed. Not the stocking itself. The feeling that there was another way my body could exist in the world, another way I could relate to myself that didn't fit the furniture arrangement of our household. As I got older, I learned to file that feeling away. I got good at it. I was a practical kid. I wanted approval the way some kids want candy. I learned what got laughs, what got praise, what got adults to relax around me. I became helpful. I carried groceries. I mowed lawns. I joined activities that made sense for a boy. I wasn't miserable, but I was vigilant, always checking myself for anything that might be read as wrong. The vigilance was exhausting, but it also made me feel accomplished, like I was succeeding at being normal. Puberty didn't arrive like a thunderclap. It arrived like a slow closing of doors. My shoulders broadened. My voice dropped. People began speaking to me as if I'd been promoted into something I hadn't applied for. "You're the man of the house when your dad's not around. You need to toughen up. You'll be a heartbreaker." The comments weren't cruel. They were casual. That was the worst part, the way they treated expectations as obvious facts. Around that time, I discovered that I could borrow moments. When my parents were out, I would take something small and reversible, something that felt like a whisper rather than a declaration. Sometimes it was a shirt with a softer cut. Sometimes it was the way I held myself, the way I walked, the way I let my hands move when nobody could see. I didn't have makeup. I didn't know how to do hair. I wasn't trying to pass. I didn't even have that concept. I was trying to breathe. Then came the shame. It came in pieces, assembled by things I overheard. Adults laughing at a man on television who looked like a woman. Kids at school using words like girly as an insult. A relative making a joke about men in dresses, as if it was self-evidently pathetic. I learned quickly that what I was doing, however innocent it felt to me, belonged to a category that people treated as disgusting or ridiculous. I began to see myself through their eyes before they ever saw me. That's one of the crueler tricks shame plays, it doesn't wait for evidence. So I did what many people do when they're scared, I tried to outgrow myself. I lifted weights. I lowered my voice on purpose. I practiced being more blunt, less expressive. I dated because that was what you did. I laughed at jokes I didn't find funny because I was afraid that silence would look like agreement with the wrong side. I became a good actor in my own life, and I didn't even know I was acting. I just knew that the part one played got me through the day. But what I had put away didn't disappear. It matured. It became less about clothes and more about the larger question underneath them: what if I'm not the person everyone assumes I am? Not in the sense of having a hidden scandal, but in the sense of having a hidden interior. What if the way I'm supposed to move through life isn't the only way I can be healthy? The first time I said anything out loud about it was not brave. It was clumsy. I was 19, in a cramped dorm room, talking late at night with a friend who had a talent for listening without trying to solve. We were talking about nothing important, then somehow we were talking about everything. I admitted, in a rush, that sometimes I liked wearing women's clothing. I remember my mouth going dry as I said it, like the air had turned to dust. I expected disgust or laughter. Instead, my friend blinked and said, "Okay. How does it make you feel?" That question was so simple it made me want to cry. Not because it fixed anything, but because it treated my experience as something real. I said the first honest thing that came to mind: it makes me feel like I'm not pretending. Even as I said it, I felt the weight of what that implied about the rest of my life. I didn't become free after that conversation. I didn't start dressing differently in public. I didn't come out in some dramatic speech. What changed was something quieter: I stopped believing I was alone. That was the first crack in the wall. In my early 20s, I moved into my own apartment, and privacy gave me both relief and new fear. Relief, because I could explore without the constant risk of being discovered. Fear, because without external rules, I had to face myself. When you're young, you can hide behind the idea that you're just experimenting, just passing through. But the more time I spent in my own space, the more I realized I wasn't looking for novelty. I was looking for alignment. At first, I treated it like a secret hobby. I bought a skirt, then returned it because I panicked. I bought a blouse and left it in a bag for weeks. I threw things away and then bought them again. I told myself it was harmless and also told myself it was evidence of something wrong. I could hold both thoughts at the same time, which is a very human kind of suffering. I wish I could say I handled it gracefully. I didn't. I isolated. I overworked. I avoided friendships that might lead to closeness, because closeness makes questions inevitable. When I did date seriously, I tried to keep this part of myself locked away, as if love could be built around a missing wing. The relationships weren't disasters, but there was a persistent dullness to them, the sense that I was managing impressions instead of sharing a life. It took a specific kind of conflict to force change, the conflict of responsibility. I met the person who would later become my spouse, and what struck me at first wasn't romance in the movie sense. It was the feeling that I could speak and not be corrected. They asked about my day and actually wanted to know the answer. They cared about how I treated waitstaff. They noticed when I shut down and didn't punish me for it. The relationship felt like standing near a warm fire. It made me aware of how cold I had been. With that warmth came a terrifying thought: if I keep hiding, I'm going to build a life out of partial truths. And if I reveal, I might lose the safest thing I've ever had. I waited too long. I told myself I was protecting them from confusion. What I was really doing was protecting myself from consequences. The problem with protection is that it can look a lot like control. I controlled information. I controlled timing. I controlled how lovable I seemed. And the more I controlled, the less real I felt. The night I finally told them, it wasn't planned. We were folding laundry, a task so ordinary it almost felt like a joke that it could hold something this heavy. Shirts and socks and towels. The gentle intimacy of domestic life. I watched them fold a sweater with care, and something in me broke open, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a tired surrender. I said, "There's something I haven't told you because I've been scared." My voice sounded like someone else's. I expected questions first. I expected them to need time, to step away, to look at me like a stranger. They did need time, but their first response was not anger. It was concern. "Are you okay?" they asked, as if the point was my well-being, not their comfort. That question humbled me. It also made it impossible to keep talking in vague terms. I told them, slowly, that sometimes I wore women's clothing, that it wasn't about attraction or spectacle, that it made me feel grounded, like my nervous system quieted down. I told them I didn't know exactly what it meant. I told them I was ashamed. There was a long silence. Not the kind that punishes, but the kind where someone is taking you seriously. They said, carefully, "I don't want you to live in shame. But I need to understand what you need, and what this means for us." That sentence contained both kindness and boundary. I didn't realize until then how much I needed both. We talked for months, not in one endless emotional marathon, but in small conversations that fit into real life. In the car. Over dinner. After a difficult day. And slowly we started to separate what was true from what was assumed. True, I had a persistent need to explore femininity in myself. Assumed that this meant I was deceiving them, or that I would inevitably leave, or that it had to be sexual, or that it meant I hated being seen as a man. True, I carried anxiety and depression that I had managed through performance. Assumed that all of it could be solved by willpower. We also had to face something uncomfortable. Even when someone loves you, they have their own history with social norms. My spouse was supportive, but they were also afraid of what it would mean socially, afraid for my safety, afraid for our family's reactions. Those fears weren't betrayal. They were realism. The world can be cruel, and love doesn't erase that. We made choices together, and this is where the phrase "learning the roles slowly" finally became something more than a private motto. We didn't decide overnight that I would live as a woman, or that I would never dress again, or that it would be a secret forever. Instead, we asked a different question: how do we build a life where I don't have to disappear, and where our relationship stays honest and respectful? The first change wasn't clothes. It was responsibility. I realized that part of what I had idealized about femininity was not the outfits, it was the emotional labor, the attention to detail, the caretaking that I saw women doing constantly, often without thanks. I had been drawn to the permission to be gentle, yes, but I had also overlooked the cost. I didn't want to romanticize a feminine role as if it was some peaceful alternative to masculinity. I wanted to learn it as a set of skills and expectations that real people live under, sometimes unfairly. So I started at home. I took on more of the invisible work, not as a performance, but as a correction. I learned what it meant to remember birthdays without being reminded. I learned what it meant to notice when we were running low on soap, when the pantry needed restocking, when a friend of my spouse was struggling and needed a check-in. I learned to communicate in a way that wasn't just efficient, but connective. I learned to apologize without arguing my intent. I learned to ask, "How did that land for you?" instead of assuming that being technically right was the same as being kind. And alongside those changes, we introduced small, practical routines that allowed my gender expression to exist without taking over our lives. Sometimes, after dinner, when the chores were done and the house was quiet, I would dress in a way that felt right to me. Not extravagant. Not theatrical. Just honest. A soft top. Comfortable leggings. A cardigan. Sometimes I would practice voice, not to mimic stereotypes, but to explore a range of expression. I learned that my normal voice had a tension in it, like I was always bracing. When I let that tension go, my voice softened naturally, not into a caricature, but into something less defended. The first time I wore a simple outfit around my spouse without rushing, without acting like it was a guilty secret, I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. I felt exposed because I was letting myself be seen in a state of sincerity. I watched their face for signs of disgust. I watched their posture, their breathing. They smiled gently and said, "You look calmer." And I realized that calmness, not thrill, was the most consistent effect this had on me. It was like stepping out of an armor I didn't realize I'd been wearing. Still, calmness didn't mean ease. There were nights when I stared at myself in the mirror and felt grief. Grief for the years I spent policing myself. Grief for the version of me that was always trying to earn permission. Grief for the fact that I couldn't make this simple for everyone I loved. And there were nights when I felt angry, too, not at people individually, but at the narrowness of the options society offers. Why did softness have to be gendered? Why did clothing carry moral weight? Why did my peace have to look like a threat to someone else? Around that time I started therapy. I want to say that clearly because it's easy to romanticize self-discovery as something you do alone with enough courage. For me, therapy was not a luxury. It was structure. It gave me a place where I didn't have to perform normalcy. It also forced me to take responsibility for my choices. My therapist didn't treat crossdressing as inherently good or bad. They treated it as information. They helped me notice patterns, how I used secrecy as a way to avoid rejection, how I used overachievement as a way to buy safety, how I sometimes used femininity as an escape from the pressures of masculinity instead of confronting those pressures directly. One of the most important things I learned was the difference between exploration and avoidance. Exploration expands your life. Avoidance shrinks it. If I only dressed when I was stressed, only when I was lonely, only when I felt like I couldn't handle being myself, then it became a coping mechanism that could turn brittle. But if I integrated it into a broader life of honesty, relationships, and responsibilities, it became a form of self-knowledge rather than self-erasure. The next phase of learning the role slowly was social, and it was the hardest. I had to decide whether this would remain entirely private or whether I would risk being known. The risk wasn't abstract. I thought about work. I thought about family. I thought about safety in public spaces. I thought about whether my spouse would become collateral damage, judged for being with me, asked questions they didn't deserve. I didn't want my identity exploration to become a burden I placed on other people without consent. So we moved carefully. I started by telling one person, then another, choosing those who had shown empathy in other situations. I learned that coming out, even in a limited way, is not one conversation. It's a series of negotiations with reality. Some people responded with tenderness. Some responded with awkwardness that softened over time. Some responded with silence that felt like a door closing. None of it was as simple as my fear predicted, and that was its own lesson. Anxiety is often a storyteller that only writes tragedies. My family was the most complicated. I didn't tell my parents for a long time. Not because I didn't love them, but because I understood the furniture arrangement in their minds, and I feared what would happen if I moved it. When I finally told my mother, I did it with the same approach I had learned in therapy, not a confession, not an apology, but an honest statement. I told her I had been exploring a feminine side of myself through clothing and presentation, that it helped me feel whole, that I was not asking her to understand everything overnight, but that I wanted to be truthful. She cried. Not because she hated me. She cried because she was frightened. "I don't want people to hurt you," she said. That fear was love, but it was also a warning about the world she knew. Then she said something that stung. Did I do something wrong? It wasn't selfish, it was a mother trying to locate a cause she could fix. I told her, gently, that she didn't cause it, that it wasn't a disease, that it was part of me, and that the pain came from hiding, not from the clothing. We sat with that for a long time. My father took longer. His silence had always been his way of managing discomfort. When I told him, his face tightened like he was bracing for impact. He didn't yell. He didn't laugh. He said, "I don't understand." That was honest. Then he said, "Is this going to ruin your life?" That question, too, was love filtered through fear. I told him I didn't want my life to be ruined by secrecy and shame. I told him I was working, taking care of my responsibilities, trying to be a good partner, trying to be mentally healthy. I asked him, not for immediate approval, but for time. He didn't hug me. He didn't say he was proud. But he didn't cut me off, and for him, that was a kind of effort. The consequences I feared did arrive in smaller forms. A relative made a comment at a gathering that sounded like concern but carried judgment. A friend distanced themselves without explanation. I learned that some people can tolerate complexity in theory but not in the face of someone they know. I also learned that I couldn't control that. I could only control how I behaved, whether I responded with bitterness or with clarity, whether I treated others with respect even when they struggled, whether I held boundaries without cruelty. There was also an internal consequence that surprised me. I started noticing how much I had internalized sexist assumptions about femininity. When I first began learning the role, there were moments when I caught myself thinking of femininity as softer, kinder, more emotionally intelligent by default, as if women were naturally better at care and men were naturally worse. That belief was flattering to femininity but still a trap, because it turns real human skills into stereotypes and it lets men off the hook for learning them. I didn't want to claim a traditionally feminine role, as if it was an escape hatch from responsibility. I wanted to respect the reality that women, in many families, have been forced into those roles without choice, and that calling it fulfilling doesn't erase the burden. So I tried to live with more integrity. If I was going to embrace parts of femininity, I needed to do it with humility, without pretending I suddenly understood what it meant to navigate the world as a woman. I could experience judgment, yes. I could experience the way people police gender. But my experience would never fully match someone who has been treated as female from childhood. I had to hold both truths, my pain was real, and my perspective was partial. That balance became one of the most educational parts of this journey, because it taught me empathy without appropriation. As time went on, the practice became less about dressing up and more about how I lived. I started paying attention to how I took up space in conversations. I noticed how often I interrupted. I noticed how often I tried to solve instead of listen. I practiced a different kind of presence, responsive instead of dominant, curious instead of certain. Not because men must be one way and women another, but because I had been trained into a narrow style of masculinity that didn't fit me well. The femininity I explored became a counterbalance, a way of giving myself options. There were practical rituals that helped. Learning skincare not as vanity but as care. Learning to keep a home that felt welcoming. Writing thank you messages. Remembering anniversaries. Checking in with friends. None of these are exclusive to women, and I don't say them as if they are. I say them because in my upbringing they were coded feminine, and I had avoided them out of fear of being seen as weak. Reclaiming them didn't make me less of anything. It made me more reliable. At one point, my spouse and I had a difficult conversation that I still think of as a turning point. They said, "I support you, but I need to know that this isn't something you used to disappear from hard parts of life." It was a fair request. They had seen me, in my worst moments, retreat into solitude. They had seen me use my inner world as a bunker. I told them I didn't want this to be an escape. I wanted it to be integration. And then we made agreements. Not rules born of control, but agreements born of partnership. We set times to talk. We checked in about comfort levels. We made space for their feelings, including grief and confusion, without turning those feelings into a veto over my identity. We treated it like any other major life change, something that requires communication, patience, and mutual respect. The suspense in this part of my life wasn't about whether someone would catch me. It was about whether I would live honestly without becoming self-centered. That sounds like an odd way to put it, but it's real. Self-discovery can become narcissistic if it forgets that other people also have lives, limits, and needs. I didn't want to demand applause for being brave. I wanted to become a person who could be trusted, including by myself. There was a day, years into this journey, when I left the house wearing a modest, feminine outfit for the first time. Not a costume, not a statement piece, just clothing that felt like me. I had thought about doing it for months and delayed every time. That morning my hands shook. I checked the mirror and didn't see a spectacle. I saw a nervous person trying to live. The fear wasn't only about strangers. It was about what it would mean to me if I was mocked. Would I crumble? Would I retreat forever? Would I become bitter? I walked to my car. A neighbor waved. I waved back. Nothing happened. In the grocery store, a cashier said hello, scanned my items, asked if I wanted a receipt. The world didn't applaud, and it didn't collapse. That was its own kind of relief. But later, in a different place, a man stared a little too long and smirked. It wasn't violent. It wasn't overt. It was a reminder that some people enjoy the power of judgment. My stomach tightened. My old instincts surged, disappear, apologize, become invisible. Instead, I breathed, kept my posture steady, paid for my things, and left. The victory wasn't that I felt fearless. The victory was that I didn't abandon myself. Afterwards, I sat in my car and realized I had been treating public life like a stage where I could be booed off at any moment. I had given strangers too much authority over my inner world. That day didn't cure me of anxiety, but it offered evidence. I could survive being seen. As the years passed, I stopped thinking of my identity as a question with one final answer. I used to believe that if I could just label myself correctly, everything would settle. But life isn't like that. People evolve. Contexts change. What you need at 20 is not what you need at 40. What mattered more than the label was the practice, honesty, responsibility, compassion, and mental health. I learned to speak about this without shame and without evangelizing. Not everyone needs to understand my experience in order to respect it. And not everyone is safe to tell. I learned the difference between privacy and secrecy. Privacy is a boundary that protects your well-being. Secrecy is a cage built out of fear. The difference is whether you feel like you are allowed to exist. I also learned that it's possible to hold masculinity and femininity as tools rather than prisons. On some days, I present more masculine. On other days, I lean into femininity. Sometimes it's about comfort. Sometimes it's about what feels aligned with my mood. Sometimes it's about the social environment and what is safest. The point is not to become perfectly consistent. The point is to be truthful and respectful, to treat my choices as part of a life that includes other people. There were still hard moments. Holidays where I could feel relatives watching me, trying to decide which version of me they were allowed to acknowledge. Work situations where I weighed authenticity against professional risk. Times when my spouse was tired of being asked indirect questions by others, tired of the assumption that they were either a hero or a victim rather than a person in a partnership. We had to grieve the simplicity we didn't get to have. And we had to celebrate the depth we gained instead. One of the most grounding realizations came when I began to see how much of my earlier distress was not caused by crossdressing but by the rigid policing of selfhood. The act of wearing different clothing was never the real danger. The danger was living a life where I had to split myself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. That split leaks into everything: irritability, depression, numbness, resentment. Integration didn't mean I always felt good. It meant I was no longer at war with myself. I also became more attentive to younger people navigating identity. Not in a preachy way, and not by assuming their journeys would match mine, but by offering the thing I had needed most: a calm, non-sensational space to talk. I learned to say, "You're not broken," without rushing them into conclusions. I learned to encourage mental health support, to encourage patience, to encourage respect for family dynamics while still protecting one's own dignity. I learned that empathy is not agreement, it's the willingness to treat someone's inner life as real. If you're listening to this and you're in the early stages, I want to name something that took me a long time to accept: fear doesn't mean you're wrong. Fear often means you're standing near something important. But fear also needs guidance. It needs boundaries, support, and responsibility. You don't have to make your whole life about this, and you don't have to erase it either. You can learn slowly. You can build routines that help you stay grounded. You can seek therapy if you're struggling. You can choose who to tell and when. And you can treat the people you love with honesty and care, not by hiding forever, but by communicating in ways that respect their humanity as well as yours. Today, when I look back, I don't see a dramatic transformation. I see a long series of small choices, choosing to be truthful with my spouse even when it scared me, choosing to take on the invisible work of care rather than romanticizing it, choosing to face my own internalized stereotypes, choosing to practice resilience in public without demanding that the world be immediately kind, choosing to forgive myself for the years I spent hiding, choosing to keep learning rather than insisting on a final, perfect identity statement. Learning the roles slowly became less about a traditionally feminine role, and more about learning how to live with tenderness and accountability at the same time. It taught me that fulfillment isn't a costume you put on. It's a relationship you build with yourself and others, one honest day at a time. Thank you for watching and spending this time with me. If this story helped you understand yourself or others a little better, feel free to explore more on the channel.